One tray of warm biscuits, and a murder no one expected. Welcome to Echo Files. I am your host, Walter Finch. Drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from today. I can't wait to read every single one before the story unfolds. The sun hung lazily over the quaint village of St. Mildred's, casting a soft, honeyed glow over its crooked chimneys and rose-tangled fences. The villagers were in particularly high spirits that Saturday afternoon, for the annual garden fete at the vicarage was in full swing. Children darted between tables laden with sponge cakes and scones. The brass band played Greensleeves with determined cheer. And Mrs. Partridge, famed for both her formidable chin and her lemon drizzle, was busily collecting compliments. Miss Jane Marple, sitting serenely in a wicker chair near the tea tent, regarded the cheerful commotion with mild amusement. Her blue eyes, though clouded a little by age, missed very little. The young men were vying for the attention of the new schoolteacher, Miss Lydia Harcourt, while the postmistress, Mrs. Finch, gossiped in a conspiratorial whisper about the rumored engagement of the butcher's son. All very ordinary for St. Mildred's, Miss Marple thought. Ordinary. And yet, as she knew from long experience, human nature had a habit of revealing its sharpest edges at the most festive of times. It was just past 3 o'clock when the tranquility shattered. A sudden cry rang out from the tea tent, high-pitched and panicked. Cups clattered to the grass. A small cluster of villagers gathered at the source, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and dread. Within seconds, the murmurs spread like ripples across a pond. "Something's happened to Mr. Willoughby." Miss Marple rose at once, leaning lightly on her walking stick, and made her way forward at her unhurried pace. There, slumped across a table beside a plate of still-warm cinnamon biscuits, was Mr. Harold Willoughby, the village's most punctilious bank clerk and self-appointed authority on parish finances. His normally ruddy face was ashen, his thin hands curled inwards as though gripping at the very air. Dr. Rowe, the village physician, pushed through the gathering crowd. He pressed his stethoscope against Willoughby's chest, frowned, and then straightened. "I'm afraid—" He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of all the eyes upon him. "Mr. Willoughby is dead." A collective gasp ran through the fete, punctuated by the distant bray of a donkey from the petting pen. Miss Marple observed the scene with quiet gravity. Mr. Willoughby's teacup had rolled to the grass, its dregs forming a dark crescent in the lawn. On the table, a single cinnamon biscuit lay broken in two, its sugared edges glinting innocently in the sun. Already the speculation began to hum around her. "Heart attack," muttered Mr. Jenkins, the greengrocer. "Choked on a biscuit, more like," whispered Mrs. Finch. "Well," Mrs. Partridge sniffed, "I always said cinnamon was an untrustworthy spice." Miss Marple merely inclined her head, listening. She noted, almost absently, the trembling hand of young Miss Harcourt as she dabbed her lips with a handkerchief. And in the shade of the mulberry tree, she glimpsed the baker, Thomas Ellery, watching the scene with a peculiar stillness, his flour-dusted hands clenched tightly at his sides. To the casual eye, it was a tragedy at a village fete, nothing more. But Miss Marple had seen too much of life to mistake sudden death for mere misfortune. There was, she felt with an almost imperceptible shiver, something very strange indeed about the way Mr. Willoughby had died. And the village of St. Mildred's was about to reveal far more than its taste in sponge cakes and cinnamon biscuits. The village of St. Mildred's had always thrived on its gentle rhythm. Milk delivered at 8, the post arriving promptly at 10, and gossip flowering like wisteria in every shaded lane. But the sudden death of Mr. Harold Willoughby shattered that rhythm as thoroughly as the teacup now lying in shards beneath the vicarage tent. By the time the doctor had confirmed what everyone already feared, the whispers had grown into a steady, tremulous murmur. Mrs. Finch, the postmistress, was the first to break the uneasy silence in a voice pitched only slightly lower than a trumpet. "I knew he wasn't well. Poor man, he's been looking peaked these past weeks. I told Mabel at the post office just last Monday. Didn't I say so, Mabel? He was gray as a ghost." "Yes, dear," said Mabel obediently, though her wide eyes kept darting toward the lifeless figure. "But gray or no, people don't usually fall down dead over a biscuit." "Heart," muttered Mr. Jenkins again, arms folded across his substantial belly. "My cousin went just the same. One moment he was singing in the choir, next he was face first in the hymn book." He nodded sagely, pleased to have contributed a medical insight. Meanwhile, the vicar, a mild, balding man named Reverend Harper, wrung his hands with visible distress. We must clear the children away," he stammered. "This is no sight for young eyes. Mrs. Harper, perhaps gather them by the donkey pen? And, oh dear, what is the proper procedure in such a case?" The doctor, crouched by the table, glanced up. His voice was calm, if a touch uneasy. "Naturally, we shall notify the authorities. Sudden death in a man of his age. Well, it could be a heart attack. But—" he hesitated, casting a glance at the broken biscuit. "It may be wise to exercise caution before moving the body." It was at that precise moment that Inspector Graves arrived, summoned by a breathless errand boy. He was a square-built man in his late 40s, with a mustache that seemed to bristle with authority. Within moments, he had established a rough cordon around the tea tent, gently but firmly shepherding the more curious villagers away. "Right, let's have some order here," he said, removing his bowler hat and mopping his brow. "No sense standing about gawping. Dr. Rowe, I'll want a word. Reverend, keep folks calm, if you please. We'll get this sorted." Miss Marple, still seated in her wicker chair nearby, observed the shifting social currents with the same patient care she might apply to a game of whist. She noted that most of the villagers had retreated to the lawn in little huddled knots, each already piecing together the story as they would later recount it. For the people of St. Mildred's, truth was often less important than the performance of knowing it first. Near the refreshment table, Lydia Harcourt clutched her handkerchief so tightly that the lace trembled. Miss Marple's gentle gaze lingered on the young schoolteacher for a moment. Lydia had arrived in the village only 3 months ago, full of nervous energy and a quick, darting smile that seemed to hide some inner uncertainty. Now, her face was pale and rigid, her dark eyes fixed on the plate of cinnamon biscuits as if they might spring to life. Thomas Ellery, the baker, stood further off, half in shadow beneath the mulberry tree. His usually jovial, round face was unreadable. But his hands, Miss Marple noticed this keenly, were working at his apron in a slow, repetitive twist. His biscuits had been the pride of the fete, and now one of them was the stage for sudden death. A sudden burst of indignant chatter carried across the lawn from Mrs. Partridge, whose sense of propriety had survived the shock unscathed. "Mark my words, there's something not natural about this," she declared to anyone within earshot. "Men do not simply keel over at tea parties, not unless they've been up to some mischief. And Harold Willoughby was not a man without enemies." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose a fraction, though she said nothing. Enemies. The word hung in the summer air like the distant toll of a bell. Inspector Graves conducted a brisk round of questioning, beginning with those who had been nearest the tea tent. The witnesses offered overlapping accounts, colored by their own biases. "I saw him take the biscuit," said Mrs. Finch. "He chose the cinnamon, never could resist spice, you know. And then he had a sip of tea, and then he went all funny in the face. Eyes bulged like this." She demonstrated with some relish. "Did he say anything?" the inspector asked. "Oh dear," she said promptly. "Just that. Oh dear." And down he went. Dr. Rowe cleared his throat. "Inspector, I can't certify a cause of death at present. There may be an underlying condition, of course, but—" He glanced toward the plate, then at Thomas Ellery. "It would be prudent to retain the refreshments for examination." Ellery flushed. "My biscuits? Inspector, I'll have you know I've been baking for 20 years without a soul dropping dead from so much. As a currant bun, I wouldn't hurt Harold Willoughby. He was, well, he was a difficult man, but I had no quarrel with him." "Difficult?" Graves's mustache bristled. "In what sense?" The baker hesitated, glancing toward the huddled villagers. "He kept accounts. Liked to poke into other people's business. He said last week I owed for church roof repairs, which I don't. He could be unpleasant." That single word, unpleasant, sent a subtle ripple through the assembled villagers. It was true, though none had said it aloud until now. Harold Willoughby had possessed a particular talent for small, needling inconveniences. He had scolded the children for scuffing the post office step, lectured Mrs. Finch about her handwriting on Christmas parcels, and once publicly accused the vicar of miscounting the collection. He had been a man difficult to like, yet impossible to ignore. Miss Marple, still silent, sipped her tea, cooled now and faintly bitter, and allowed the voices to wash over her. She did not watch the speakers so much as the listeners. It was there, in the small flickers of reaction, that truth often peeked through the cracks of polite performance. She noted how Lydia Harcourt flinched slightly when Ellery mentioned quarrels, though she tried to disguise it by smoothing her skirt. She noted how Mrs. Partridge's certainty swelled with every word, eager to shape the narrative before facts interfered. And she noted, too, that behind the immediate shock, some villagers already seemed to settle into a guilty relief. Willoughby had been a thorn in many sides. Death had a way of rearranging moral tolerances. Inspector Graves eventually turned to Miss Marple with a respectful nod. He had learned long ago that the gentle spinster from the end of the lane had a peculiar knack for understanding what people meant rather than what they said. "Miss Marple," he said, lowering his voice, "you were here. Anything strike you as odd?" She gave a mild smile, her hands folded in her lap. "Odd? Why, death itself is always a little odd when it comes so suddenly. But I did happen to notice that Mr. Willoughby selected his own biscuit, quite deliberately. He even inspected the plate first. A very cautious man in such small matters." Graves frowned. "Cautious?" "Oh, yes," said Miss Marple with a soft chuckle. "A man who dislikes surprises, which makes his sudden death all the more interesting." Her tone was almost apologetic, as though she were remarking on the weather, but her eyes twinkled with quiet comprehension. Human nature, she reflected, had a tendency to repeat itself like an old story, sometimes in the most tragic ways. By the time evening shadows began to lengthen over St. Mildred's, the fete had dissolved entirely. The bunting sagged, the lemonade glasses stood abandoned, and the cinnamon biscuits had been taken into the inspector's custody. Villagers drifted home in subdued clusters, voices low and nervous. Behind lace curtains and half-drawn blinds, the night would thrum with whispers. And in the quiet sitting room of her ivy-clad cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair with her knitting, her needles clicking softly as the day's events threaded themselves into order in her mind. There had been fear, yes. Shock, certainly. But also, she thought, a peculiar undercurrent of something else. Guilt, perhaps, or the shadow of an old secret finally stirring. Somewhere in St. Mildred's, she felt sure. Someone knew precisely why Harold Willoughby had died. And she, in her gentle, unassuming way, intended to find out. The following morning, St. Mildred's awoke to a strange, brittle stillness, as if the village itself were holding its breath. The sun rose bright and golden, gilding the hedgerows and chimneys. Yet the light did little to warm the sense of unease that had settled overnight. By the time the church bells tolled 8, the first whispers of the previous day's tragedy were already drifting from garden gate to kitchen window. At precisely 8:30, Inspector Graves returned to the village green, accompanied by a constable carrying a stout leather case. He moved with a deliberate heaviness, as if the weight of the investigation rested squarely on his shoulders. There was no fat bunting now, no cheerful tables, only the flattened grass where laughter and teacups had reigned the day before. He glanced toward the vicarage, where Reverend Harper stood in the doorway, wringing his hands, and then toward the cluster of cottages beyond, where curtains twitched like nervous eyelids. By 9 o'clock, Graves had begun his formal inquiries. He started with the vicarage drawing room, which now served as a makeshift headquarters. A single long table was set with paper, an inkpot, and a plate of untouched scones that Mrs. Harper had insisted upon. Outside the window, the summer garden fluttered with roses, incongruously serene. Thomas Ellery, the baker, was the first to be summoned. He arrived with flour still dusting his apron, his round face tight with worry. He twisted his cap in his hands and stared at the carpet as if wishing to sink through it. "I've told you already, Inspector," he said, voice trembling only slightly. "I didn't put anything in them biscuits that I wouldn't eat myself. And I did. Ate one right after the poor man fell, though perhaps I shouldn't have. But there's nothing wrong with them. I swear on my mother's grave." Graves studied him a moment, mustache bristling. "You understand why we must ask. A man dies suddenly after eating one of your biscuits. You admit you had words with him in the past." Ellery's jaw tightened. "He made everyone's life difficult, sir. But I'd never... Murder? That's not in me. Ask anyone." Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner, as if she had merely dropped in for tea, observed Ellery's posture and the faint flush creeping up his neck. Fear, yes, but not the brittle, defensive fear of guilt. More the clumsy panic of a man aware he has become the village scapegoat. Graves nodded curtly. "You may go for now, Mr. Ellery. Stay in the village. We may need to speak again." When the baker left, Lydia Harcourt entered next. She was pale, her dark hair hastily pinned, her hands fidgeting with a small lace handkerchief. She sank into the chair opposite Graves with the air of someone bracing for impact. "You were near the table when Mr. Willoughby collapsed," Graves began. "Tell me exactly what you saw." Lydia's voice was soft, almost hesitant. I saw him take the biscuit. He looked, I don't know, annoyed. He muttered something under his breath. I thought perhaps he was judging the bake." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Judging? That does sound like Harold, doesn't it?" she said mildly. "He was rather fond of pointing out little imperfections. A slightly overbaked edge, a touch too much spice." Lydia gave a nervous laugh that was more like a hiccup. "Yes, he could be sharp. I didn't like to be near him." He always made me feel as though I were under examination. Did you have any quarrel with him? Graves asked, leaning forward. The young woman hesitated just long enough for Miss Marple to notice. No, she said at last, though her tone carried a faint tremor. None at all. I hardly knew him. But her fingers, Miss Marple saw, had twisted the lace handkerchief into a tight spiral. Young people were not as skilled at masking truth with composure as the older generation. That slight hesitation told her far more than Lydia intended. By midday, the inspector had spoken to half a dozen villagers. Each offered the same basic account. Willoughby had eaten a biscuit, sipped his tea, uttered, "Oh dear," and collapsed. Yet within these repeated details, Miss Marple discerned a pattern forming, a pattern shaped not by what was said, but by what was carefully not said. At 1 o'clock, the constable returned from the market town, carrying the preliminary report from the local pathologist. Graves read it aloud in the quiet drawing room. "Poison," he said grimly. "Confirmed. Small traces of strychnine." A soft gasp escaped Mrs. Harper, who had been lingering in the doorway with a tray of tea. She nearly dropped the cups. Poison? Oh, heavens. In our village. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap. "Strychnine," she repeated in her mild, almost curious tone. "That is not something one encounters by accident, and not something one slips into a biscuit without intent." The inspector gave a sharp nod. "This confirms it. We're looking at murder, and likely someone here in St. Mildred's had reason enough." The news spread like wildfire. By late afternoon, the village buzzed with speculation. Farmers paused at gateposts to confer in low voices. Children were called indoors early, and behind every window, the unspoken question pulsed. Who among us is a killer? Miss Marple took a different approach. She did not chase whispers, but instead walked the village lanes as if on an ordinary errand, stopping to chat with those who might otherwise have gone unnoticed. At the smithy, she learned that Willoughby had argued about a debt only a week prior. At the post office, Mrs. Finch confided that he had intercepted a letter meant for Lydia Harcourt. "A mistake," he'd said, though the girl had gone white when told. And near the green, young Billy Partridge shyly mentioned seeing Willoughby near the allotments after dusk, looking right cross, like someone stole his carrots. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple arranged her day's observations like puzzle pieces. Motive, opportunity, and method, these things always repeated, for human nature was stubbornly predictable. Someone had both the knowledge and the will to use strychnine. Someone who had cause to see Harold Willoughby gone, and perhaps felt the village would sigh in quiet relief at his passing. As dusk settled, a knock sounded at her door. It was Lydia Harcourt, eyes wide, clutching her shawl. "Miss Marple?" she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. I think I need to tell someone before the inspector finds out another way." Miss Marple led her in without a word. The young woman sat on the edge of the floral sofa, trembling. Outside, the night chorus of crickets swelled, and the first lamps flickered to life in the village. "It's about Mr. Willoughby," Lydia began, her voice breaking. He was blackmailing me." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, the faintest nod betraying no surprise at all. The investigation had just taken its first sharp turn. Lydia's words seemed to hang in the little parlor, brittle as the ticking of the mantel clock. The air smelled faintly of lavender polish and the roses Miss Marple had cut that morning. But underneath was the sharp tang of fear that clung to the young woman like damp mist. Miss Marple leaned forward, her gentle eyes resting on Lydia's trembling hands. "Blackmail, my dear?" That is a most unpleasant thing to endure. Perhaps you had better start at the beginning." Lydia swallowed hard, twisting the edge of her shawl. "It started a few months ago, after the Fate Committee meeting. Mr. Willoughby, he saw me coming out of the post office. I just collected a letter from my cousin in London. It was nothing at all, but—" She faltered, and a flush rose to her cheeks. It was addressed in a gentleman's hand. He started insinuating things. He said a young lady like me, living alone with my aunt, ought to be careful what rumors might start. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles silent in her lap now. "And he asked for something in return for his silence?" Lydia nodded, tears pooling. "At first he said he only wanted little favors, like helping him with his garden or running errands. Then he wanted money. I had none of my own, so I sold a brooch my mother left me. He promised it would be the last time. But 2 weeks ago, he saw me walking home with Mr. Carroway from the rectory. We'd just spoken about the flower arrangements, that's all, but Willoughby started hinting again. He said he'd tell the whole village I was compromised." Her voice broke. "And the letter?" Miss Marple prompted softly. "It was nothing," Lydia whispered. "Just my cousin's fiancé thanking me for the wedding gift. But Mr. Willoughby, he was cruel. He made me feel like every step I took was being watched." Miss Marple let the young woman cry quietly for a moment, her mind sifting through this new layer of the puzzle. Blackmail provided motive, yes. It explained Lydia's terror. But fear alone did not equate to murder. Lydia's soft hands, her hesitant manner. She hardly seemed the sort to slip strychnine into a biscuit at a village fete. "Did he threaten you yesterday?" Miss Marple asked finally. Lydia sniffled, nodding. "Just before he died. He leaned close when no one was looking and said, 'You owe me another little favor, my girl, or perhaps the whole village would like to read that letter.' I couldn't bear it. I left the green and went behind the church. That's when I heard the shouting and someone said he'd fallen. I ran back and—" Her voice faltered again, haunted by the memory of the man's lifeless form. Miss Marple reached over and patted her hand. "You were frightened, but you did not harm him, did you?" The girl's head shook violently. "No, I swear it." "I believe you, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "But the inspector may be less inclined toward sympathy if you withhold this. Better that he hear it from you than from gossip." As Lydia left, the twilight deepened into the velvety blue of summer night. Miss Marple watched the girl's small figure retreat down the lane, the faint lamplight glinting off her hair. Then she closed the door and sank into her armchair, letting her thoughts spin their quiet web. By morning, Inspector Graves was knocking at her door. His mustache bristled with frustration. "Miss Marple," he said without preamble, "I've had word that young Lydia came running to you last night. I trust you can tell me why." "I imagine she wished for advice," Miss Marple said mildly, pouring tea. "She is a very frightened young woman, Inspector, and with reason." Graves's eyes narrowed. "She told you about the blackmail, then?" "Indeed. I advised her to tell you herself, of course." "She has," he grunted. "Came in first thing this morning, shaking like a leaf. That gives her a motive clear as day, and yet—" He rubbed his forehead. "I can't see her as the type to handle poison with such nerve. Unless I'm being sentimental." Miss Marple's needles clicked, softly again. "You are quite right to trust your instincts. Strychnine is a most deliberate choice. It requires access and forethought. It is rarely the weapon of the impulsive or panicked." Then who? Graves demanded. I've questioned the baker, the vicar, the flower girls, and the blacksmith. Everyone had reason to dislike the man, but no one admits to touching the biscuits but Ellery. And the poison had to come from somewhere. Miss Marple hesitated, her eyes distant. Inspector, do you recall the incident with old Mrs. Arkwright's dog last spring? Graves frowned. The spaniel that died after raiding the shed. Vets said it was rat poison, strychnine if memory serves. Precisely, Miss Marple said softly. And do you remember who supplied her with that poison for her garden? Graves's eyes widened as the recollection clicked into place. The chemist, Mr. Pritchard. Indeed, she said, her tone mild but firm. And it might be worth discovering if any of his stock has gone missing, or if he has sold any to villagers of late. By noon, Graves had marched down to the small chemist shop on the high street. The bell above the door jingled, and the faint smell of camphor and menthol greeted him. Mr. Pritchard, a stooped man with watery blue eyes, looked up from behind the counter with a start. Inspector, he stammered, if this is about the tragedy yesterday, I assure you I've heard nothing. It's about poison, Graves said bluntly. Strychnine. When was the last time you sold any? Pritchard blinked rapidly, his fingers twitching against the countertop. Well, I keep a small quantity for agricultural purposes, rats and such. But it's strictly logged, as per regulation. I only sold some once this summer, about 3 weeks ago. To whom? The chemist swallowed. Why, Mr. Harold Willoughby, sir. He said he had trouble with vermin in his potting shed. Graves felt a thrill of dark satisfaction. The victim himself had procured the weapon of his own undoing. But Miss Marple, who had accompanied him quietly, was not satisfied with mere irony. Tell me, Mr. Pritchard, she said sweetly, did Mr. Willoughby ever return for more? Or did anyone else inquire after such a thing recently? The chemist hesitated. Well, there was one other. A week ago, Thomas Ellery came by. Asked about rat poison too, but I refused him. Said he ought to go through the proper channels. He left in a huff. Graves and Miss Marple exchanged a glance. Ellery's temper was well known, but combined with opportunity, it made a compelling picture. Yet Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful rather than triumphant. Do you suppose, she murmured, that Mr. Willoughby might have been careless enough to leave the strychnine about? Or that someone else might have borrowed it? Graves grunted. Possible. But that still puts Ellery high on the list. He had motive, means, and the opportunity at the fete. Perhaps, Miss Marple said softly. But there is another possibility. Blackmailers rarely limit themselves to a single victim. If Mr. Willoughby was extorting poor Lydia, who else might he have preyed upon? Someone with less patience and more resolve? Her words hung in the musty air of the chemist's shop, and Graves felt the first prickle of deeper suspicion. There were still shadows in St. Mildred's that had not yet been uncovered, and within them, he sensed, the true murderer waited. That evening, Miss Marple strolled slowly along the lane, her keen eyes on the warm light spilling from cottage windows. Somewhere behind one of those lace curtains, the person who had measured out poison and planned a death was sipping tea as if nothing had changed. But she felt the threads of the puzzle tightening, drawing her closer to the heart of the secret. And when she paused at the edge of the green, she thought she saw the faintest movement at the window of Willoughby's empty cottage. A flicker of shadow against lamplight, as if someone were inside where no one ought to be. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. The investigation was about to turn another corner. The shadow flickered across the window pane of Willoughby's cottage, faint and furtive against the soft glow of the oil lamp within. Miss Marple paused at the edge of the green, her walking stick resting lightly against the gravel path. It was well past 9, and the summer sky had folded into a deep navy, the last whispers of twilight gone. No one should have been in that cottage. Inspector Graves had sealed it that morning after finishing his search. Yet there it was, the unmistakable silhouette of someone moving inside. Her first impulse was to go directly to Graves, but instinct, sharpened over decades of quiet observation, told her otherwise. There were times when a direct confrontation frightened away the truth like a bird startled from a hedge. This was a moment for careful, unobtrusive action. She slipped into the shadow of the hawthorn hedge and circled the cottage on silent feet, the gravel muffled beneath the soft soles of her shoes. The cottage was modest, a single-story affair with a slate roof, ivy crawling along one side, and flower beds that had long ago surrendered to weeds. From this vantage, Miss Marple could see the back door was ajar. Faint lamplight spilled across the worn flagstones, and a soft rustle came from within. Whoever was inside had not taken the trouble to be entirely quiet. Miss Marple's breath was steady. She was not afraid, not precisely. Danger in St. Mary Mead, or here in St. Mildred's, always wore a local face, familiar and human. And it was that familiarity that made it all the more dangerous. She edged closer until she could peer into the small kitchen through the half-open door. The intruder was hunched over the table, his broad back to her. Even in the dim light, Miss Marple recognized the stocky frame and rough wool coat of Thomas Ellery. He was rifling through a drawer, muttering under his breath. On the table lay a jumble of papers, a leather ledger, and what looked to be a bundle of envelopes tied with string. Miss Marple's mind clicked through the implications with the precision of a watchmaker. Letters. Of course, if Willoughby had blackmailed one young woman, he had almost certainly kept trophies of others, written proof of his leverage. And Ellery was here for something he could not risk the police discovering. She waited until his search reached a crescendo of frustration, drawers slamming, a muttered curse, before she cleared her throat softly. "Mr. Ellery," she said, her voice calm but carrying, "you do realize this is a crime scene?" The man spun around, eyes wide, his weathered face pale beneath the lamplight. For a moment he looked like a cornered animal, every muscle taut. "Miss Marple, what are you doing here?" "I might ask you the same," she said mildly, stepping fully into the doorway. "It seems a rather inopportune hour to be going through the late Mr. Willoughby's things." Ellery's fists clenched and unclenched. I'm not stealing, if that's what you think. I had to find something. Something of mine." Miss Marple tilted her head, the faintest smile touching her lips. "A letter, perhaps?" The man's jaw tightened, and his silence spoke louder than words. "I see," she continued, stepping into the lamplight with the deliberate calm of someone entering a drawing room rather than a crime scene. Mr. Willoughby had a certain talent for making life uncomfortable for others. Young Lydia was not his only victim, I think. Perhaps he threatened to expose something about you, too. Ellery hesitated, then let out a ragged sigh. He had a note I wrote. Foolish of me. I was angry with the vicar over the land dispute last winter, and I said some things in writing I shouldn't have. Willoughby found it, said he'd take it straight to the magistrate if I didn't pay him off. It would have ruined me, Miss Marple. My father left me that land, and I'd have lost it for sure if they thought I was threatening the church. And now you came to recover your letter, before Inspector Graves could find it, she said gently. Ellery's shoulders slumped. I didn't kill him. I swear it. I thought about it. Lord knows I did. But I couldn't do it. I was in the alehouse when he went down, and you can ask anyone there. Miss Marple believed him. There was a weariness in his voice that rang true, a defeated honesty that rarely accompanied guilt of the fatal sort. Still, she reached for the bundle of letters on the table and carefully untied the string. Names leapt out from the envelopes. Lydia's, Ellery's, and several others. She noted one in particular, written in elegant feminine script, addressed to Mrs. Farnham, yes, the vicar's wife. She replaced the letters gently and tied the string once more. Mr. Ellery, I suggest you leave now and go straight home. I will see that the inspector is made aware of the blackmail, and I expect he will be pragmatic in his approach, given the circumstances. But do not tamper with the evidence further. The truth must come out, and it will not be helped by panic. Ellery hesitated, then nodded grimly. Without another word, he slunk into the night, the door closing softly behind him. Miss Marple lingered in the empty cottage, her sharp eyes moving over the dim room. She felt the shape of the puzzle shifting again, pieces sliding into place. Willoughby's death was not a crime of passion born from a single quarrel. It was the culmination of a web he had spun himself, a net of secrets and leverage that touched more villagers than anyone had guessed. His killer, she was now certain, had acted not merely out of fear, but with calculation. The next morning, Miss Marple presented the bundle of letters to Inspector Graves. His expression went through a fascinating series of transformations: shock, exasperation, and finally grim understanding. Half the village in this stack, he muttered. No wonder no one's talking straight. He had them all dancing like puppets. Indeed, Miss Marple said. But you see, Inspector, this tells us something important. Whoever killed him must have known about these letters, or feared them. And more importantly, the killer was clever enough to strike at a moment when suspicion would naturally fall on one of the more obvious victims, like poor Lydia or Mr. Ellery. That speaks to a certain cunning. Graves rubbed his temple. You mean someone who didn't just want him gone, but wanted the village to believe it was someone else entirely? Miss Marple nodded. Her mind returned to the letter addressed to Mrs. Farnham, a genteel lady, outwardly impeccable, whose husband's reputation was beyond reproach. A scandal there would have been devastating. And she had been standing near the refreshment table all afternoon at the fête. Inspector, she said at last, her voice soft but certain. I think our murderer is closer to the heart of the village than anyone imagines. And tonight, I believe we may have the chance to catch her in a misstep. Graves blinked. Her? Miss Marple only smiled faintly, her needles resuming their quiet work. Let us say, for now, that the web is tightening. By tomorrow, I believe the strands will draw our culprit into the open. Outside, the sun slid behind the yew trees, casting long shadows across the green. Inside, the village secrets thickened like the evening mist, waiting for the final unraveling that Miss Marple knew was very close at hand. The evening air in St. Mildred's carried the faint scent of rain as Miss Marple sat by her window, the knitting needles in her hands moving with steady rhythm. Outside, the lamplighter was making his rounds, casting warm pools of light that seemed to draw the darkness in closer, leaving the corners of the green in thick shadow. She preferred to think in quiet moments like this, where the ordinary comforts of domestic life allowed her mind to sift through the extraordinary ugliness of murder. She reviewed each thread of the case as if it were a stitch in her knitting. Mr. Willoughby's death had at first appeared to be a simple matter of local grievance. A disliked man, a public quarrel, and a convenient suspect. But the letters, the ledger of secrets he had so meticulously kept, revealed a far more intricate pattern. Blackmail had ensnared half the village in fear. Many had reason to wish him dead, yet only one had taken that final, irrevocable step, and Miss Marple believed she now knew who. Her eyes drifted to the small bundle of letters that Inspector Graves had reluctantly returned to her for safekeeping, recognizing that her discretion would be as valuable as any evidence chain. Among them, the letter addressed to Mrs. Farnham stood out like a bruise beneath a silk glove. A single note, carefully written, implying impropriety, real or imagined, could shatter the vicar's household. In the world of quiet English villages, that was tantamount to social ruin. Miss Marple set her needles aside. It was time to test her theory. She arrived at the vicarage the following morning, her knock soft but deliberate. Mrs. Farnham opened the door herself, a vision of composure in dove-gray wool. Yet her eyes flickered, ever so briefly, to the basket Miss Marple carried on her arm. "Good morning, dear," Miss Marple said with a pleasant smile. "I thought I might bring over some scones. There's nothing like a bit of comfort when the village is in such a state." "How thoughtful of you," Mrs. Farnham replied, her voice even. "Do come in. I confess, it's been a dreadful few days." Miss Marple allowed herself to be shown into the sitting room, where sunlight slanted through the lace curtains. She chatted amiably about the weather, the late roses in the churchyard, the unfortunate gossip that had begun to swirl since the fete. And then, with the same casualness with which she might remark on a missing teaspoon, she said, "I've been helping Inspector Graves sort through Mr. Willoughby's papers. Such a muddle. But of course, he kept copies of everything. Even the letters he used to frighten people. Quite a few familiar names in there." The teacup in Mrs. Farnham's hand trembled, ever so slightly. She steadied it quickly, but not before Miss Marple's keen eyes had taken note. "I should think," Miss Marple continued, "that it is a dreadful relief to many that the inspector now holds those letters. No more danger of Mr. Willoughby waving them about, hinting at this or that. It does make one wonder, though, if his persistence might have driven someone to desperate measures." Mrs. Farnham's lips pressed together, her composure straining like a thin thread. "Surely you don't believe anyone respectable would—" She stopped, realizing she had said too much. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice low and gentle. "My dear, blackmail is a terrible thing. It drives good people to acts they would never imagine in ordinary life. And desperation, well, it makes even the most respectable among us consider permanent solutions." There was a long silence. Outside, a bird called from the yew tree, and somewhere down the lane, a cart rattled over the stones. Finally, Mrs. Farnham set down her teacup with a soft click. "He was going to ruin us," she whispered. "Do you understand, Miss Marple? He said he would tell my husband, show him the letter, and it would destroy everything we've built. He didn't care. He enjoyed it. He wanted to see me beg." Miss Marple's expression was one of profound sympathy, though her heart was hammering with the quiet satisfaction of confirmation. "And so," she said softly, "you found a way to make sure he could not threaten you again." Mrs. Farnham's eyes filled with tears. "It was only supposed to be a warning. I went to speak to him after the fete, just to plead, to tell him to stop. He laughed at me. He said he'd make sure the whole village knew. And then Then I saw the paperweight on his desk. I only meant to frighten him. But he lunged for the letter and I struck him. The words hung in the sunlit room, heavy and irrevocable. Miss Marple reached over and patted the woman's trembling hand. "You were very foolish, my dear. But I do understand." Her voice grew firmer. "And now you must tell Inspector Graves exactly what you have told me. He is a fair man, and he will see the truth of the circumstances. Better to face it with honesty than to let suspicion ruin others who are innocent." Later that day, Miss Marple stood once again at the edge of the village green, watching as Mrs. Farnham was quietly escorted to the inspector's motor car. There was no public scene, no clamor of scandal yet. Graves had wisely chosen to handle the matter with discretion. As the car drove away, the inspector approached Miss Marple, his face set in that familiar mixture of respect and exasperation. "I suppose I should be used to this by now," he said. "You've saved me from arresting the wrong man." Again, Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest smile. "It was only a matter of observation, Inspector. People reveal more than they realize, if you're patient and attentive. And Mr. Willoughby, for all his scheming, left a trail as clear as a row of footprints in the snow." Graves shook his head with a faint chuckle. "You do make it sound simple, but I know better." Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the fading sun. The village was returning to its gentle rhythm. Children's laughter echoing near the pond, the scent of bread wafting from the bakery. Life in St. Mildred's would go on, though the memory of Mr. Willoughby's fate would linger as a whispered warning against malice and deceit. And as she resumed her quiet walk home, her knitting tucked under her arm, Miss Marple reflected, as she often did, that even the smallest villages contained entire worlds of human folly. The days that followed Mrs. Farnham's quiet confession settled over St. Mildred's like a fine mist. The immediate storm of the murder had passed, yet the village seemed to hold its breath, as though reluctant to return to normalcy too quickly. Windows opened cautiously in the mornings. The clatter of teacups in the tea room was softer than usual, as if any loud noise might summon the specter of Mr. Willoughby back from the grave. Miss Marple, however, went about her routine with the serene precision of one who had seen such human tragedies before. She watered her geraniums, mended a neighbor's torn sleeve, and appeared each afternoon in her garden as if to remind the village that life, like the seasons, continued its inevitable turn. But inside her tidy sitting room, she continued to reflect on the case and its ripples through the delicate web of village society. She had often considered how murder in a small place left deeper scars than in a great city. In London, crimes could be swallowed by the vastness, becoming a brief headline and a topic for strangers' fleeting conversation. Here, in the tight, interwoven lives of St. Mildred's, the crime was a stone cast into a still pond, its ripples touching every doorstep and heart. The inquest was held 3 days later, discreetly arranged by Inspector Graves to avoid turning the affair into a spectacle. Mrs. Farnham, pale but composed, recounted the events of that fateful evening in a voice that trembled only once. When she described the instant of unthinking fear that had led to the fatal blow. The coroner listened gravely, the small panel of local men shifting uneasily in their chairs. They had all known Mr. Willoughby, and none could quite bring themselves to speak of his death as a tragedy. One man murmured under his breath that the village might be better for it, earning a stern look from the vicar, who sat silently at the back, his hands clasped tightly. The verdict was returned as manslaughter under extreme provocation. A quiet gasp rippled through the small assembly. but there was also a strange sense of relief. The law had spoken with Mercy, and the matter, for all practical purposes, was concluded. Mrs. Farnham would not hang, nor vanish into some distant prison. She would live under the weight of her own conscience, which Miss Marple privately thought the heavier burden. That evening, as twilight painted the green in shades of lilac and silver, Inspector Graves called upon Miss Marple once more. He found her by the window, knitting as always, though she set her work aside with a smile of welcome. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, settling into the armchair opposite her. "It's done. Paperwork, statements the lot. I dare say you've solved this case more efficiently than my whole department could have managed." "Oh, I shouldn't think so," she replied with a modest tilt of her head. "You did all the proper work, Inspector. I merely recognized a familiar pattern." "Pattern?" he repeated, shaking his head with admiration. "You always say that, and yet it's a knack no one else seems to have." She poured him a cup of tea and stirred a single sugar cube into her own. "It is simply that people, in the end, are much alike. When cornered by fear, they reveal themselves. Mrs. Farnham was not the first respectable lady to be driven to desperation by a scoundrel, and she will not be the last. Mr. Willoughby made the fatal mistake of believing he could play with human weakness without consequence." Graves sipped his tea, considering her words. "I keep thinking about her husband. Poor fellow. He looked as if the earth had shifted under his feet at the inquest." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, gazing out at the lengthening shadows. "He has discovered that the world he thought he knew is far more fragile than he believed. That is the true cruelty of such affairs. They tear at the very fabric of trust." There was a long, companionable silence, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Outside, the first evening star appeared. In the days that followed, the village began its slow process of mending. Mrs. Farnham, under the watchful guidance of her solicitor, retreated from public life for a time. The vicar threw himself into his duties with a solemn devotion, visiting the sick, tending the churchyard, and preaching sermons that spoke of forgiveness and the quiet strength of truth. As for Mr. Willoughby's house, it stood shuttered, the once tidy garden growing wild. Rumor had it a distant cousin would inherit, though few in St. Mildred's seemed eager for the place to be occupied again so soon. It had become a house of whispers, a reminder of the darkness that had briefly descended upon their peaceful lanes. Miss Marple, for her part, accepted these changes with the same gentle stoicism that defined her every act. One afternoon, she received a small note slipped under her door. It was unsigned, but the delicate handwriting left no doubt as to the sender. "Thank you. I do not know what would have become of me if not for your kindness. I will strive to be worthy of the second chance I have been given." Miss Marple read the note, folded it neatly, and placed it in the small writing desk by her window. She would not answer it, for some things were better left as quiet acknowledgments in the heart rather than in ink. Life in St. Mildred's resumed its quiet rhythm. The gossip that had once burned like wildfire dwindled to embers, and eventually to the faintest wisp of smoke. New concerns emerged. Mrs. Larkin's geese wandering too far afield, the debate over whether the harvest fete should feature a brass band or a string quartet. To the casual eye, nothing had changed at all. But Miss Marple knew that beneath the surface, the village had absorbed its lesson. The memory of Mr. Willoughby's malice and the desperate act it provoked would linger in subtle ways. In the gentler tones of conversation, in the unspoken understanding that cruelty has a cost. One evening, as she sat on her garden bench, her knitting resting in her lap, she watched the golden light fade over the hedgerows. The air was cool and still, carrying with it the faint fragrance of late roses. A young couple walked past, their heads bent close together in laughter, and Miss Marple felt a quiet contentment settle over her. For all the shadows that sometimes pass through human hearts, life had a way of returning to its gentle course. The village would bloom again in spring, as it always had. And she, in her little cottage, would continue to observe, to listen, and to understand the patterns that others missed. After all, as she often reminded herself, the smallest places held the largest truths about human nature. And in knowing those truths, she found both the sorrow and the beauty of life. The village of St. Mildred's had begun to ease back into its quiet rhythm, yet beneath its calm exterior, an invisible tension lingered, like the faint vibration of a plucked string that had not yet fully settled. Although the inquest had concluded and Mrs. Farnham had returned to her home under the gentle care of her husband, the aftershocks of the crime had left subtle marks everywhere. Miss Marple noticed it first in the eyes of the villagers. When Mrs. Price, the postmistress, crossed the green on her morning errand, she glanced behind her more often than before. Old Mr. Cotterill, who had once dozed cheerfully on his bench outside the bakery, now seemed alert and watchful, as if expecting some unseen trouble to emerge from the hedgerows. It was the natural consequence, Miss Marple thought, of having the veil of safety torn away. A village could forgive a great many small sins, late library books, whispered affairs, minor thefts of jam jars. But murder left an echo. That echo became tangible one crisp morning when Miss Marple ventured to the grocer's. She had barely stepped into the shop before two of the local women, Mrs. Blackwell and Mrs. Larkin, hushed their conversation and gave her the sort of wide-eyed look that begged for her participation. "It's the Willoughby house," Mrs. Blackwell whispered, her voice half thrilled, half fearful. "Lights in the attic. I saw them from my window last night." "And I," Mrs. Larkin added, leaning forward, "heard something. A dragging sound, like furniture or perhaps a heavy box." At nearly midnight, Miss Marple, who had learned the value of letting others speak freely, merely nodded. "Well, now, that's curious," she murmured. Inside, her mind began to align the pieces, as it always did. The Willoughby house had stood silent since the inquest, its windows dark, its door bolted with a legal seal. A distant cousin was meant to inherit, but the paperwork, she knew, was still winding through the slow machinery of the law. No one should be inside. And yet, she left the grocer's with her small parcel of tea and a mind alight with quiet suspicion. That evening, she sat by her window, knitting resting in her lap, and watched the old house across the green. The sun fell. The sky shifted from lavender to indigo, and one by one, the lamps in the village winked out. By 10 o'clock, only the pale light of the moon silvered the street. At 10:30, the faintest glow appeared in the attic window of the Willoughby house. It flickered, not like the steady beam of an electric lamp, but the restless glow of a lantern or candle. Miss Marple leaned closer, her pulse calm but alert. After a moment, the light vanished. The next morning, she walked the garden path to her neighbor Mr. Denning's gate. He was a widower with a kindly disposition, and more importantly, a clear view of the Willoughby property from his upstairs landing. "Good morning, Mr. Denning," she said warmly. "Tell me." Did you happen to notice anything unusual at the old Willoughby place last night?" Mr. Denning, eager to be useful, nodded at once. "Indeed I did, Miss Marple. Around 10:30, a light in the attic, plain as day. I thought I might be imagining it, but—" He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I even heard a sort of metallic clink, as though someone were handling tools or chains." "Chains," she repeated softly, and thanked him with a smile before continuing on her way. By afternoon, she had composed a careful letter to Inspector Graves. She did not request his immediate presence. He was a busy man and had already endured the village's ordeal. But she suggested that the Willoughby house might benefit from a discreet inspection. By the next morning, he was on her doorstep. "You never fail to surprise me, Miss Marple," he said, after she explained what she had seen. "I thought this case was well and truly finished." "Oh, I dare say it is," she said mildly. "But human nature is very rarely tidy, Inspector. When someone believes a house is abandoned, it invites mischief, or worse, the settling of unfinished business." Graves raised an eyebrow, but agreed to investigate. Together, they crossed the green in the bright light of mid-morning, the village pretending not to notice their purposeful walk. The front door of the Willoughby house creaked as Graves tested the lock. The seal was broken. He exchanged a look with Miss Marple before pushing the door open. A stale, dusty air greeted them, tinged with something faintly metallic. Inside, the hall was dim, but the thin curtains allowed enough light to reveal scuff marks on the floor. "Lantern soot," Graves murmured, pointing to a faint black smudge along the stair rail. "Someone's been up and down recently." They ascended carefully, the old steps groaning beneath their feet. The bedrooms were as they had been left after the hurried search during the original investigation. Dusty, forlorn, with a sense of abandonment that clung to the wallpaper. It wasn't until they reached the attic that the story revealed itself. A trunk sat in the middle of the floor, its lock forced open. Inside lay a jumble of old documents, jewelry cases, and, most damningly, bundles of cash wrapped in fading bank paper. Graves whistled low. "Well, this is Willoughby's hoard. He'd been bleeding the village with his schemes for years, and here it is. Someone knew it was here, or guessed." Miss Marple's eyes roved the space, taking in the fine layer of dust disturbed by recent activity, the narrow footprints, and the faint scuff of a man's heel near the window. And someone broke in to claim it. Not Mrs. Farnham, certainly. She would never return here. No, this feels more like an opportunist. Perhaps even someone who feared the police might find it first. Graves examined the window and found the latch unfastened. "Came in this way, most likely. We'll have to ask around quietly, see if anyone's been flashing sudden wealth or acting nervous." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Do take care, Inspector. Desperation can be as dangerous as malice, and I suspect whoever came here last night may return for whatever he could not carry." That night, Graves set a watch, and Miss Marple, despite her years, sat by her window once more, knitting in hand. She had learned that the heart of a mystery often revealed itself not in grand gestures, but in small, predictable acts of human folly. Near midnight, a shadow crept across the garden of the Willoughby house. A man, hunched and furtive, climbed through the same window he had forced before. Moments later, the dark figure emerged carrying a sack, and was met by Graves and his constables, who stepped from the hedgerow with lanterns blazing. The man froze, then dropped the sack with a metallic clatter. When his face was revealed, the village would be shocked. But Miss Marple had already guessed. It was Mr. Cotterill, the dozing pensioner who had spent decades on his bench by the bakery. His small pension barely kept him fed, and he had once delivered firewood to Mr. Willoughby. In that service, he had seen the miser carry his hoarded cash into the attic trunk. Desperation and opportunity had driven him to trespass and theft. The scandal rippled through St. Mildred's the next day, though quieter than the first. Unlike murder, theft could be forgiven in time. But to Miss Marple, the episode was a reminder that one crime often breeds another, that darkness lingers like smoke even after the fire's put out. She reflected, as she watched the constables carry the recovered trunk to the station, that the Willoughby affair had revealed every shade of human weakness. Greed, fear, pride, and the small deceits that become great tragedies when left untended. And she knew, as always, that the patterns of human nature would continue to repeat in St. Mildred's and beyond. The arrest of Mr. Cotterill sent a ripple through St. Mildred's, not a violent wave like the discovery of the murder, but a steady, unsettling tremor. Villagers now whispered more softly at the market, peering over their shoulders as though expecting more secrets to crawl out of the woodwork. And Miss Marple, sitting by her window with her knitting needles clicking softly, understood that the Willoughby affair was not yet entirely finished. Though the trunk of hoarded cash and jewelry had been retrieved, and Cotterill now sat in the small holding cell at the county constabulary, there remained a deeper, more troubling question. What had truly motivated the murder of Mr. Willoughby? His death, the theft, the inheritance squabbles, and the nocturnal break-ins all seemed connected by the thread of human nature. But there was a knot still unresolved. Inspector Graves came calling the morning after the arrest, his hat in his hands, his face lined with fatigue, but alive with thought. "I've been over Cotterill's statements," he said without preamble, lowering himself into Miss Marple's sitting chair. "He swears he had nothing to do with the murder, claims he only took the money because he knew about the hoard and thought no one would miss it now Willoughby was gone." Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-loop. "Do you believe him?" Graves hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "I do. His story holds. He'd no reason to risk murder when he could just wait. But that leaves us with an awkward truth. The original killer is still out there, and I fear the village has started to forget." "Oh, I dare say they will remember soon enough," Miss Marple murmured. "Crimes have a way of resurfacing, particularly when they are not fully solved. People think they can sweep wickedness away, but it lingers, like a draft under a closed door." Graves leaned forward. "If not Cotterill, then who? Mrs. Farnham is innocent. Her breakdown was the result of shock, not guilt. Young Mr. Willis, the groundskeeper, has an alibi, and the doctor's timeline cleared him as well. I feel as though the case is slipping into the fog." Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. "Fog, yes. But fog always lifts if one waits. Tell me, Inspector, what of Mr. Willoughby's papers? The ones found in the trunk?" Graves frowned. "Financial ledgers, mostly. Records of loans, interest. He was bleeding the village dry for decades." "Why?" "Because," Miss Marple said softly, resuming her knitting, "murder is very rarely about pure malice. It is nearly always about the intersection of opportunity and fear. Someone feared what those papers might reveal, or what Willoughby himself might do next." 2 days later, the fog began to lift. It started with a small, almost unremarkable event. Mrs. Larkin arrived on Miss Marple's doorstep, clutching a thin, crumpled letter. "I didn't know if I ought to bring this to the inspector," she said nervously. "It was pushed under my door this morning. Miss Marple accepted the letter delicately. The handwriting was uneven, almost shaking with haste. If you want to know the truth about the Willoughby matter, look in the old mill before the rain comes. Midnight. No signature. No indication of who had sent it. Curious, Miss Marple said, reading it twice. The old mill is quite isolated, is it not? Near the stream? Mrs. Larkin nodded. No one's used it in years. Gives me shivers, that place. Then I think, said Miss Marple gently, you had better let the inspector handle it. These matters are not for evening walks alone. By twilight, Inspector Graves had been alerted, and a small party of constables lay in wait near the mill. Miss Marple, despite her age, had insisted on accompanying them. Graves had learned by now that her presence was less a risk than a safeguard. The night was damp and heavy with the scent of rain. The mill loomed as a hulking shadow against the faint silver of the moon, its broken sails creaking in the wind. Hours passed in stillness, until at last a lone figure approached along the muddy path, carrying a lantern. "Steady," Graves whispered to his men, and they held their positions in the dark. The figure reached the mill, pushed the warped door open, and disappeared inside. Moments later, a light flared through the cracks of the boards. That was Graves's cue. He and his constables advanced swiftly, lanterns raised, and burst through the door. Inside, crouched beside a damp wooden beam, was none other than Mr. Denning, the mild widower who had supplied gossip and eager testimony in the early days of the investigation. His face was pale as chalk when the lantern light struck him, and the bundle at his feet told the rest of the story, more of Willoughby's missing wealth hidden away in a second cache. "Mr. Denning," Graves said sharply, "you've some explaining to do." The widower trembled, his hands lifted in surrender. I didn't mean for it to go so far. I only meant to frighten him, to make him hand over the money he owed me. But he fell." The confession tumbled out in broken fragments, but the gist was clear. Denning had confronted Willoughby in his home that fateful evening, driven by a mixture of desperation and resentment. Willoughby had refused to yield, and in the scuffle, Denning had shoved him. The old man had struck his head on the hearthstone and died instantly. Panic had followed. Denning had fled later, returning under cover of darkness to find and move the hoarded money, fearing the police would discover it and trace the motive to him. When Cotterill's own opportunistic theft complicated matters, Denning had grown more desperate, attempting to retrieve the last of the stash before anyone suspected him. Miss Marple stood quietly through the confession, her face unreadable. Only when Graves had given orders to secure Denning and the evidence did she speak. "You see, Inspector," she said softly, "human nature seldom fails." Mr. Denning seemed so gentle, so unassuming, that no one would suspect him capable of violence. But gentlefolk are not immune to the pressures of fear and want. He feared ruin, and in that fear, a single reckless act became the root of tragedy. Graves sighed, looking both relieved and saddened. "And with that, Miss Marple, I believe the Willoughby affair is truly at an end." The village woke to the news with a strange mixture of shock and relief. Mr. Denning had been part of the scenery of St. Mildred's, as familiar as the church steeple or the bakery doorbell. And now he was gone, carried off to face justice. People spoke of the affair in hushed tones, as though the very air of the village might hold the memory of its shame. Miss Marple, for her part, returned to her quiet life with the air of one who had merely confirmed what she already knew. She sat in her parlor, the autumn light slanting across her teacup, and thought about the curious symmetry of the case. Greed feeding fear, fear feeding violence, and violence ultimately giving way to the quiet inevitability of truth. She knew that, in time, St. Mildred's would recover. Life would resume its slow rhythm of church bells, market days, and village fetes. Yet under that gentle surface, she would always see the glimmer of human nature's hidden currents, and she would always be ready, should the pattern repeat itself. And for now, the village exhaled, unaware that Miss Marple, in her quiet way, was already considering the next puzzle that life might place at her doorstep. The winter sun was thin and pale as it slipped over St. Mildred's rooftops, casting long, cold shadows across the frosted lanes. Though the village had, at last, settled into a new rhythm after the shocking resolution of the Willoughby affair, there lingered an almost imperceptible air of caution in the way neighbors spoke to one another. Trust, once cracked, is not so easily mended, and the murder had left a quiet scar on the heart of the community. Miss Marple noticed it in small details as she made her morning rounds to the post office. The way Mrs. Larkin avoided eye contact when she passed the Willoughby cottage, the hesitant greetings exchanged outside the grocer's, and the hollow echo of the church bell, which now seemed to ring not just for worship, but as a reminder that even the gentlest villages could harbor darkness. She knew time would soften the edges, but she also knew that some stories left an indelible mark. Inspector Graves called upon her one afternoon, stamping the frost from his boots and rubbing his gloved hands for warmth. "It's all finished now," he said with a mixture of relief and weariness as he settled into her armchair. "Denning has confessed in full. The Crown prosecution is confident the jury will convict. I believe he'll likely plead guilty to spare himself a trial." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles moving with their steady, hypnotic rhythm. "I imagine that will be for the best. Trials in such cases do very little but reopen wounds for everyone involved." Graves leaned back, exhaling. "It's a peculiar feeling, you know. We've solved the crime, caught the culprit, and yet the village doesn't feel safe, exactly." "That," said Miss Marple softly, "is because safety is often an illusion. It's the illusion we wrap around ourselves, believing that bad things happen elsewhere, to other people. When the illusion shatters, it takes some time to put the pieces back together." Graves nodded slowly. "You've a way of putting things, Miss Marple. I suppose that's why I came, to hear it said plainly. You always make sense of the messy parts." Miss Marple offered a faint, kind smile. "I only observe what is there, Inspector. The rest, human nature provides on its own." And the weeks that followed brought subtle changes to St. Mildred's. Mr. Willoughby's cottage, long a place of suspicion and whispered gossip, now stood shuttered and empty. Ivy crept up its weathered stones, and on misty mornings it seemed to vanish into the fog entirely, like a memory the village wished to forget. The vicar announced that a small portion of Willoughby's estate, what remained after the debts and legal settlements, would be donated to the church to aid the needy. Some villagers grumbled about taking tainted money, but others accepted it as a fitting end, a final gesture that transformed greed into some measure of good. Mrs. Farnham recovered gradually, though she walked with a haunted look that never entirely left her face. She no longer attended market days as often, and instead tended to her garden, finding solace in the predictable rhythm of the seasons. Mrs. Larkin, too, grew quieter, though she made a point to bring small baskets of apples or fresh bread to neighbors, as if to stitch the frayed threads of community back together. And Miss Marple, ever the patient observer, watched the village slowly heal, as it always did, by folding the extraordinary back into the ordinary. One evening, as the first snow began to fall, she sat by her fire reflecting on the case. The crackle of the hearth seemed to punctuate her thoughts. It was not the solving of the mystery that lingered in her mind, but the intricate weave of human motives that had led to murder. Mr. Denning had never been a villain in the theatrical sense. He was, in truth, a man much like any other. Lonely, frightened of poverty, quietly resentful of the injustice life had handed him. In her long life, Miss Marple had seen that pattern too many times to count. A small seed of desperation that, under the right storm, grew into a fatal act. The memory of his trembling voice during his confession returned to her. He had not intended to kill. He had only intended to reclaim some fragment of dignity in a world that had left him diminished. And yet, as she knew all too well, intentions rarely absolved actions. She sipped her tea and whispered to herself, as if to the flames, "It is always the quiet ones." The story of Mr. Willoughby's murder eventually slipped from the front of villagers' minds. Winter yielded to the tender greening of spring, and with it came new rhythms. Market stalls of fresh produce, the buzz of bees in blooming hedgerows, and the return of laughter to the lanes. Children played again near the old mill, heedless of its dark history, and the constable returned to his usual routine of lost dogs and the occasional squabble over hens. Miss Marple's life, too, returned to its gentle patterns. She tended her garden, corresponded with her far-flung relatives, and listened without comment to the ever-churning river of village gossip. But now and then, when the light slanted just so through her parlor window, she would recall the look on Denning's face, or the hush that had fallen over St. Mildred's in the days before the truth was known. She carried the knowledge quietly, as she always did, that beneath the lace curtains and polished teapots of any village, no matter how quaint, ran the same eternal currents of human nature: greed, fear, love, envy, and hope. One afternoon in early summer, Inspector Graves visited her again, this time bearing a small wrapped parcel. "A little token," he said, placing it on her side table. "The chief constable thought it only right that you receive some recognition. After all, we'd still be groping in the dark without your insight." Miss Marple chuckled softly and unwrapped the parcel. Inside was a small silver magnifying glass, engraved with a single word: gratitude. "How thoughtful," she said, holding it up to the light. "Though, you know, I never needed one of these to see clearly." Graves smiled, tipping his hat as he rose to leave. "No, Miss Marple, that I already knew." She watched him depart down the lane, his figure shrinking into the golden afternoon, and for a moment she allowed herself a quiet satisfaction. Not for the recognition, she had never sought that, but for the simple reassurance that the world, however shadowed at times, still had a way of righting itself in the end. As the evening light deepened, Miss Marple settled back into her chair, her knitting resting in her lap. The village of St. Mildred's was peaceful once more, the rhythms of life restored. But she knew, as surely as the seasons turned, that somewhere, sometime, another story would find its way to her door. And when it did, she would be ready with a cup of tea, a sharp mind, and the quiet understanding that human nature, in all its complexity, never truly changed. The evening sun dipped low, bathing St. Mildred's in a warm, amber glow, as the last chapter of the Willoughby affair quietly closed. The village, once rattled by suspicion and whispers, had found its way back to the ordinary rhythms of life. Yet in Miss Marple's small, neat sitting room, a gentle air of finality hung, as if all the threads she had patiently untangled now rested neatly knotted in her mind. Inspector Graves sat opposite her, his hat in his hands, his expression reflecting both weariness and gratitude. He had come to deliver the final details, but more than that, to share in the quiet satisfaction of resolution. "It's all finished," he said, exhaling slowly. Denning entered a full confession this morning. The evidence was already damning, but his statement fills in the last missing piece. He said he never meant for it to happen the way it did. He only went to confront Willoughby, to demand the return of what he believed was rightfully his. A push, a struggle, and the poker sealed his fate. Miss Marple's hands remained steady on her knitting, though she allowed herself a small sigh. "It is always a terrible thing," she said softly, "when a person lets desperation grow louder than conscience. Yet it is just as I feared. The crime was born not of monstrous evil, but of very ordinary human weakness." Graves nodded, his voice quiet. "You were right about the missing ledger, too. We found it hidden behind a false panel in the cottage, just where you suggested. Denning had hoped it would clear his name in the inheritance dispute. But when he realized it did the opposite, well, I suppose panic drove him to the only path he could see." "And panic," Miss Marple murmured, "has led to many a tragedy in this world." For a moment, the fire crackled softly between them, and the silence was companionable rather than heavy. Outside, the laughter of children drifted up the lane, mingling with the distant toll of the church bell. Life was moving on, as it always did, stitching its gentle patterns over the darker seams of recent weeks. Graves leaned forward, his tone softening. "I can't tell you how grateful I am, Miss Marple. Without your keen eye for the small things, the teacup left in the wrong place, the footprints by the garden wall, I might still be fumbling in the dark. You saw the truth in a way no constable's report ever could." She gave him a modest smile, her needles clicking softly. "I've always found that the truth is like a loose thread on a fraying jumper, Inspector. Tug at it just the right way, and the whole pattern reveals itself." The conclusion of the case rippled through St. Mildred's quietly but firmly. The Willoughby estate was settled, with a portion gifted to the parish and the remainder divided as the law dictated. The once feared cottage at the edge of the lane would remain shuttered until the solicitor could find a buyer. Mrs. Farnham slowly regained her composure, though she carried with her a solemn understanding of how close evil can lurk to the hearth. The village gossip, which had once buzzed like hornets, mellowed into soft recollections and nods of respect when Miss Marple passed. For her part, she returned to her quiet life with the same gentle grace that had defined it for years. She clipped her roses, attended to her knitting, and poured tea for the vicar's wife as though the storm had never passed through at all. Yet, in the privacy of her thoughts, she carried the story's weight with the deep acceptance that comes from a lifetime of observation. People, no matter where they live or how sweetly they smile over garden gates, remain forever capable of folly, greed, fear, and love. It is this simple truth that turns the quietest villages into the stage for the most human of dramas. One afternoon, a week after Denning's sentencing, Miss Marple received a small parcel in the post. Inside was a letter from Inspector Graves and a polished silver bookmark engraved with the words, "Foreseeing what others overlook." She smiled softly, placing it between the pages of a slim detective novel she had been rereading. "Quite fitting," she murmured, allowing herself the smallest indulgence of pride. The sun drifted across her parlor, casting the lace curtains in patterns of gold. Outside, St. Mildred's went about its day, its lanes once again filled with the ordinary music of life. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, eyes half closed, listening. Somewhere, in the great unfolding of time, another small drama of human nature would surely find its way to her doorstep. And when it did, she would be ready. Quiet, observant, and infinitely patient. For in the end, justice in St. Mildred's had not come with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. It had come with the soft unraveling of truth, the patient untangling of threads, and the gentle but unwavering hand of a mind that saw the world exactly as it was. And with that, the story of the Willoughby affair was truly at an end, leaving only the calm of a village restored, and the watchful eyes of a woman who understood, better than anyone, that the smallest things often reveal the greatest truths.